share my screen. Oh, okay. So, excuse me. So I'm going to be talking about creepy crawly snakeheads and other invasive amphibious fishes. But first, I want to acknowledge where some of this research was done. Some of this is done while I am a professor at Salisbury University. Some of this was also done at Cornell University as an undergraduate, while as a graduate student at Wake Forest, funded by an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. And some of this was done at Shoals Marine Lab in Cornell and UNH's joint marine lab off the coast of Maine and New Hampshire. So first off, I got to just go into what is an amphibious fish a little bit. There's actually a wide diversity of amphibious fishes out there. You have things like the tide pool sculpin in the Pacific Northwest that will live in these little rocky tide pools, eating little shrimps that darting in and out of the rocks and moving up and down with the tide. You have mummy chugs on the East Coast here, including in Maryland, that will also move in tide pools and over sandbars and accidentally get trapped in puddles or in tide pools that get sealed off from the ocean, and then they'll hop over land to get back. You've got these hill stream loaches, these blind fish that have no eyes, can climb these caves in Thailand, the vertical caves in a sheer amazing way. You got the classic mud skippers that a lot of people know of. You have American eels are also local here, and they can move over land around obstacles. So like they migrate through rivers, and they've been known to climb dams or move over land around dams to get away from these obstacles. You've got this Pacific leaping bunny here that actually spend more of their time out of the water. They rarely like to even get wet, get fully wet. They just like to get splashed by the waves as they graze on algae growing on the rocks. Walking catfish are a big invasive species in Florida, but they're native to Africa and Asia and the Pacific Islands. And these ones have a wide variety of amphibious behaviors that I'll get to in a little bit. And of course, you have snakeheads. There's a variety of snakehead species, about 40 different species. But the species in Maryland is the northern snakehead, and that is an invasive species from Eastern Asia. And those will come onto land for reasons that I'll get to in a little bit. And also you have this Senegalese biker. This is this primitive fish that actually has a real lung. So fish evolved lungs before they evolved to move on to land. And so some of these fish have lungs as adaptations to low oxygen environments. And then some of those took that to the next level and moved on land and became tetrapods and eventually became mammals and reptiles and people and all of that. The lungs started in fish. So I mentioned a lot there, but there are some key similarities that these fish have. There's some adaptations for terrestrial life. Like I mentioned, they have air-breathing organs, like the lungs of the biker. But you also have other organs, like these are the gill arches of the air-breathing catfish. And you can see, if you've ever seen gills of other fish, they don't usually have this branching structure. This is called the arborescent organ, or essentially the tree organ. And it's the air-breathing organ. By having all of these branches with blood vessels flowing through it, it has a lot of surface area for gas exchange, and that allows these fish, walking catfish to breathe air out of water. Snakeheads have a similar air-breathing organ, but it's not as complex as this. These fish also need to avoid desiccation, avoid drying out. And some of them will achieve it by like mud skippers, by just rolling around in mud the whole time. Or some fish will only go out of water for a little bit so they don't dry out. Whereas some will have thick scales or tough armor that prevent them from drying out as much. But these fish are still fish. If they dry out, they'll die. These fish also need to be able to move around on land to be able to be successful on land. If you can get on land, but you can't get anywhere, you can't get off land, you're a sitting duck to predators. So here's this one example of the Senegalese biker and how it moves around on land. This is slowed down a lot. And you can see it's sort of doing an army crawl where it's using a combination of its pectoral fins and its axial body, where it rotates, puts its fin down, and then rotates around that fin, puts the other one, rotates around that fin, almost like an army crawl. And that's just one way fish move around on land. There's a variety of ways fish do this, and I'll get to that as I go through my presentation. Some of the research goals, some of the themes of my research have been to figure out, why do amphibious fishes go onto land? How do they move around while on land, especially with the body of a fish? And where do they go on land? How do they orient? Are they moving randomly, or do they have goals that they're trying to move towards? So we'll start with the first one. Why? So a variety of fish go onto land for a variety of reasons. In case of this mangrove rivulus, it's a fish in the Caribbean, found all the way up to the Florida Keys, that can live for up to 2 months out of water at a time, and found in hollow, damp logs, and or actually lay their eggs on land, and they're self-fertilizing hermaphrodites. These are crazy fish I could talk about for days and days, but I'm going to focus on some more Maryland-specific ones. But these ones will leave the water if the water quality is too poor, like there's too much hydrogen sulfide in the water, stuff that's basically smells like rotten eggs and it's not good for the fish. These fish will also leave if the water gets too hot. They'll cool off through evaporative cooling, just like we do with sweating, but they'll just, if the water's too hot, they'll jump out of the water evaporate off their skin, and that'll cool them off. And if the salinity is not right, like it's too salty or too fresh, these fish will jump out of the water too to find better quality conditions. However, other fish will go onto land for different reasons. Like you have these California grunions that will move onto land under the light of the full moon from spring, late spring to early fall. And they will spawn en masse on the beaches where away from aquatic predators, where the predators can't eat their eggs. It makes them vulnerable to terrestrial predators, but that's a factor that they're weighing in this behavior. You also have some fish will come onto land to eat on land. You have this eel catfish, which is a species of air-breathing catfish. You can see here it's pouncing on this beetle. And so there's a variety of reasons fish will come onto land, perhaps to find terrestrial prey or reproduce, but you have to look at fish on a case-by-case basis. The California grunions don't go on land to feed, and these mangrove rivulus won't track down big beetles over land. And so we got to look at these by a case-by-case basis, which brings me to snakeheads. Snakeheads, the family Channidae, they all have an air-breathing organ similar to that organ from the walking catfish. And they are native to stagnant waters and floodplains of Southeast Asia, at least from the family Channa. There's some other ones from Channa in Africa, but I won't go into those. And they're native to areas that are prone to floods and droughts, where they can get stranded in puddles as the floodwaters recede and dry up, and can cause them to strand on land. And there's been some studies attempted to describe the terrestrial locomotion of some snakehead species. But most of those studies are over 100 years old and not very in-depth. The most in-depth description I've seen of these snakeheads is from this Walt Disney cartoon, this actual Walt Disney cartoon from over like 60 years ago, called Unhappy Hunting Ground. Vicious and voracious, the Asiatic snakehead. A true fish cannot abide any other fish in the same pond with him. He destroys each one, but he does not suffer from his own greed and destructiveness. He simply wriggles over land to the next pond. And so that was pretty much the full description of how they move over land. They just wriggle over land. This doesn't really tell you anything, and it's not very helpful. This brings me to the northern snakehead. I was doing research. I was like, well, these northern snakeheads are around here in the US, and I was already studying amphibious fishes. Let me study its invasive amphibious fishes, because they're abundant in the Maryland. You can see very abundant. This map needs to be updated even more, but they're abundant in Maryland. They made it to Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, New England, some Florida. There's some in Georgia now. There is, they recently entered the Mississippi River too, and that seems like they escaped from a fish farm there about 20 years ago. And they may have escaped overland into the fish farm, from the fish farm into the nearby tributaries of the Mississippi River, and that may have how they entered that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's been conflicting evidence for terrestrial behaviors of snakeheads, because most of it is anecdotal. It's not documented. People were like, oh, I caught this snakehead. It dropped on the ground and wriggled back into the water. Or I was fishing and this fish was in like 2 inches of water and was moving around, where I was like, okay, well, that's still some water. So is it really terrestrial? And despite all this conflicting evidence for terrestrial behaviors, These fish are, well, despite all this conflicting evidence, there's been numerous horror movies that are all different degrees of terrible, of snakeheads coming onto land and eating people and babies and puppies and all that stuff. And so if you may recall, about 20 years ago when snakeheads were first found in the Crofton Pond in Maryland, they were introduced from the people accidentally released them from either the aquarium trade, some people had snakeheads as pets, or from the live fish trade. Because these fish breathe air, you could transport them very well to a market and keep them alive and fresh for a while. And so some of those escaped in Crofton Pond, and once they were found, people were like, these things come onto land, they have giant teeth, they're going to eat our puppies and babies. Everybody panicked. And that's where that initial fear for snakeheads came from. And it didn't help having many, many horror movies about exactly that happening. So I wanted to separate fact and fiction and say, like, do we actually have to worry about these fish? Can they actually move over land in the first place? And so to figure that out, I had to get some snakeheads with the help of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I give them all these plastic shoe boxes with these little ramps and some water, and I put them individually in there. And that way I could give them a variety of treatments and expose them to a variety of treatments that may cause other fish to come out of land, or conditions that they may realistically experience that may cause them to come onto land. And I only use a limited sample size and only use a limited amount of time. And this is mostly to see first, will they voluntarily come onto land under any possible conditions? And the answer was yes. At least for water that was too salty for them, water that was too acidic, or water that had high dissolved carbon dioxide. And so they may naturally experience salty water at more brackish areas of the range, or in coastal ponds that may have saltwater intrusion. And low pH and high dissolved carbon dioxide are areas where there may be a lot of rotting vegetation, which happens to be areas like Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, and a lot of stagnant waters that snakeheads are actually often found in. So there are some conditions that they will voluntarily come onto land to, and perhaps even more if I use a larger sample size or use more species, more individuals, but nevertheless, this shows that under some conditions, snakeheads will voluntarily come onto land. And here you can see a little one emerging onto this platform, onto the ramp. So yes, under poor water conditions, snakeheads will come onto land. But what about other fish? Again, we have to look at each fish on a case-by-case basis. So I wanted to look at walking catfish, Clarias batrachus. This is an invasive species in Florida. It is harmful as in it eats a lot of native species and is a pest for a lot of the aquaculture farms. There are a lot of tropical fish for the country. Country's aquarium trade is grown in Florida because it's a tropical environment. And many Clarias species or fish in the Loricariidae family, including walking catfish and the eel catfish before, are known as air-breathing catfish. And these fish are known for exhibiting amphibious behaviors, including that nocturnal terrestrial feeding behavior that you saw before in that video, the image of the eel catfish eating the beetles. But these fish are thought to only emerge around heavy rains, like getting stranded by a flood, perhaps by a hurricane. But there wasn't any concrete evidence that they wouldn't come onto land otherwise. And so I was realizing, like, well, we don't know much about these catfish because we have a lot of people and a lot of anecdotal information. But as one scientist, I could only view one set of fish at a time in one space. But I figured I'll give a survey to everybody in Florida who has seen walking catfish on land, try to learn more about the conditions surrounding those observations, to piece together their terrestrial natural history. So I asked them questions about their sightings, like what was the weather like, what was the time of day, the year, what was the location, things like that. And I posted this, and I got about 88 responses from Florida wildlife-related Facebook groups. I also analyzed 38 YouTube videos to get some more information where I could see, like, oh, it's raining in this video, there's a puddle over there, there's a pond over there, things like that. And so I got a lot of data from that. I'm just going to go over a few highlights. So catfish will most frequently emerge during the daytime, but not always. You can see, so mostly they're during the day, but again, a good number of them at night, and some at dawn and dusk as well. Catfish will most frequently emerge when it's raining or wet. You can see Here's a lot more, but some will come onto land when it's sunny and there's no evidence of recent rain, showing there are some situations in which these catfish will come onto land when it's not rainy, suggesting that there may be multiple reasons they come onto land. And catfish most frequently emerge in urban areas. So most people observations were on concrete, some were on grass, and some were bare soil. But it's interesting that most were on concrete because there's not much water, like there's no body of water for them to emerge from. You don't usually just have, they're not going to be coming from concrete swimming pools in the middle of the neighborhood. And oftentimes, 2/3 of people said that they did not see any bodies of water nearby when these fish came onto land. They just seemed to appear out of nowhere, often to specifically the most common place I would see is a Payless Shoes parking lot in Lakeland, Florida. A lot of people kept seeing they would see catfish coming up in this parking lot. And so taken all together, first you have to take all this data with a grain of salt because there's some bias. You're not going to have, most people aren't going to be in the middle of the woods at night in hurricanes. They're going to be more likely looking around during the daytime on concrete urban areas when it's not rainy. But it shows that it gives some idea of some general trends. But combining this with some other interesting observations, there was 17 observations of these fish either entering or exiting storm drains. And taken together with them appearing out of nowhere nearing concrete areas, it seems like these fish are emerging when there's floods and hurricanes that connect the surface waters to the storm drains. And storm drains in Florida are a little bit different than everywhere else, just like everything in Florida, because Florida is very flat, extremely flat. And so there's no topography, there's no hills to bring water down the storm drains through gravity. So there's always standing water in there. So it's possible that these walking catfish live in the storm drain systems, essentially the sewers of Florida, emerging when it rains and the water from above is connected to the water from below. And they can come out of these storm drains, move around parking lots, move into neighborhoods, move ever, and perhaps spread to other canals or bodies of water overland, or return to storm drains when the waters recede. Also, another person who happened to be a USGS wildlife technician told me he saw many catfish on a flooded road surrounded by a bunch of like earthworms. And he collected about 50 of these in just a shopping bag, just easy to pluck them out of the road, went to go eat them at home. And he found half of those fish had those same worms in their stomach. So you know how when it rains, you see worms all over the ground. Still some debate on why worms come out of the ground when it rains, but nevertheless, it happens. And these fish may be taking advantage of these flooded terrestrial environments or wet terrestrial environments coming out of storm drains or other bodies of water to feed on these worms that are easy prey. And then when the water recedes, they return to their bodies of water where they were or spread to new bodies of water. Another interesting observation was from somebody who observed 18 catfish or so leaving a pond on a sunny day where it hadn't rained recently, moving in a group upwind about 40 meters to a cypress mound where it has standing water that was initially out of view. And so that's a good distance for these fish to move over land, and they moved in a group, but they initially could not see that water, suggesting perhaps they were detecting something in the air that was indicating that there was water there. And they're following that scent of the chemical trails of that from that cypress mound that they were orienting upwind to find. But I'll get to that more in a little bit later. So we figured out some of the reasons why amphibious fishes go onto land, whether it's to avoid poor water quality or maybe to eat worms that come out when it rains. But now let's go into how do they move around on land. So we know that snakeheads will go onto land, but can they move effectively over land? Like just because you can get on land, maybe a life or death struggle to get on land where being in water is worse off, but you're not able to have really an amphibious behavior if you can't get around on land. So if they can move on land, how do they do it? So to see if they can effectively move over land, I went electrofishing with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and collected a really wide range of snakeheads. Here you can see me holding a snakehead we just scooped up with this electrofishing boat where you basically shock the water and just stun everything like a taser, scoop up what you want, turn the electricity off, and then everything else swims away. So it's a great way to non-lethally sample the water. So I filmed a lot of these fish moving around on multiple substrates, multiple different types of ground to see if that impacts how they move. And here you can see the snakehead moving. It's not breaking any speed records, but you can see it's using a combination of its pectoral fins and its axial body and its tail to move forward. This, again, not breaking speed records, but it's going forward. You don't have to worry about them chasing you down on land and eating you, or even a small child being next to land. They're not going to be able to get them. And also fish need water to swallow, so they can't even eat anything on land unless they pull it into the water first. But nevertheless, it's moving forward. And you can see here, a side view, these fish don't lift their bodies off the water. It just kind of drags it along, which is different than this tidal sculpin. It's another amphibious fish, which really rolls over its side, lifting its belly off the ground. And so it doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to be using their pectoral fins in the same way to lift to support their body weight out of water. And that may be because this snakehead is orders of magnitude larger and heavier than this sculpin, about 1,000 times heavier. And so it may not be able to support its full weight on its fins, but perhaps it's using its fins for something else. So it's not rolling over onto their fins to support the weight. Maybe they're using it for something else. And so to see that, look at how they move on different substrates. So it's moving its pectoral fins here, but there's nothing for it to really grip on this flat ground. But on this grass, you can watch the fins be able to get better grip, and that may help them be more maneuverable on more complex terrain. And you can see it's moving a lot more quickly over more complex terrain. Similar to this rubber boat deck where it's got these little grippers, they can take advantage of complexities in the ground to help them get a better push off the ground to move forward more easily. So overall for the snakeheads, we know that they'll emerge under poor environmental conditions. They can use an axial appendage-based terrestrial locomotion. And tail flipping, when they're really young, that means they just jump to move around on land. Axial appendage-based terrestrial locomotion means they use their axial body, so their main body, and their appendages, like their pectoral fins. These, the larger the fish can also move more quickly, I found. And when the ground is sloped or it's more complex, that improves performance, so they can work with gravity, move downhill, or take advantage of those, let's say, grass or other things reaching up from the ground to give them better push off. And because they can breathe air, they can move well over land, and they'll voluntarily come onto land under some conditions. It means they have the potential to move and disperse over land into new bodies of water. But these are not the only invasive amphibious fish to do this. You also have this fish, this is a pleco. While I was doing work on the walking catfish in Florida, I was working with the University of Florida on this project, and somebody came in to the greenhouse I was working with, the catfish, to yell at me and tell me, one of your fish got out. You have to, like, this is a serious case. These are invasive species. You cannot let them out. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Like, I don't know how it happened. I went outside. I'm like, that's not a walking catfish. That's not one of mine. That happened to be a completely separate instance of a fish being on land outside of the lab. And this is a pleco, or armored catfish, suckermouth catfish. These are the fish you see sucking on a glass of a fish tank all the time. So fish not known for really going on to land. But here it is upright. They can breathe air through their gut, and they got these robust pectoral fin spines and pelvic fin spines that can support the weight on land. And they have thick armor that can prevent them from drying out. And so I was already set up for this field work to study how fish move around on land with the Walking Catfish Project. So I brought this one inside, and we already had some other plecos cleaning the other tanks. And I was able to do some work to figure out, can these plecos move over land? There's a few different species of invasive plecos in Florida, like the vermiculated sailfin catfish or the Orinoco sailfin catfish. But I wanted to look at just all of these species in general, see if they can move on land, how do they do it? Because these fish are, first, how do they do it? And how well do they move over land? A big concern I had was these fish are heavily armored. And so most fish that go on land are very flexible. That allows them to be really have a lot of range of motion. But these fish are heavily armored, and they have these weird joints that prevent them from moving their pectoral and pelvic fins in a wide range of motion. So does this armor affect the terrestrial locomotion? Does it make it harder? Do they use it for their advantage? What's going on with that? So first you can see pleco. This is actually slowed down by half speed, moving over land pretty quickly. It's using another form of axial appendage-based locomotion, using a combination of its pectoral fins, its pelvic fins, its caudal fin as its tail, and its mouth. You can see the mouth is actively moving around there. You can see the lips going a little bit. But it's very asymmetric. You can see the tail is moving a lot more to one side than the other side, which is really unusual for any locomotor behavior, because generally if you were, let's say, to move your one left leg, like take 2 foot step with your left leg and a 1 foot step with your right leg, that would just lead you in circles, but some indifference going on with them. And these fish can move over 1 meter per second in short bursts, making them one of the fastest fish on land. But here's a side view too. You can see they're coordinating their pectoral fins and pelvic fins as well as their axial body, but their tail seems to just be dragging along there. It's not really pushing against the ground. And here it seems to be over here. It seems to be swinging above the ground, not really pushing off well. So I want to take an underneath view, see what else is going on. And so this is a setup I created called a frustrated total internal reflection table. Basically what it means is there's light bouncing around inside this sheet of glass, and anything that makes contact with it will be highlighted. So you can see any point of contact is highlighted. So these fish seem to be, they will lift their mouth up, plant it down, and then they'll rotate around these fins that are planted, and they'll fling their tail around, and then they'll plant their mouth back down. And it's a combination of flinging their tail, but not actually touching their tail to the ground, using their mouth as a pivot point to protract their fins around. And then as they lift it back up so they can fling their tail forward, and they seem like most of the movement is actually coming from the inertial movement of flinging their tail forward, similar to a kid swinging their legs on a swing. And this is so unlike any other form of locomotion, any other in the animal kingdom, or it's completely different. It's using its mouth, it's using just the fins on one half of their body. It's asymmetrically swinging its tail forward. I couldn't really call it like a modified crawl or modified walk or anything. So I had to develop a brand new word for how they move over land, which I dubbed ruffling or repetitive flinging, because they repetitively fling their tail forward for them to move on land. Now let's see, does morphology, does their anatomy and structure constrain, or does it enhance ruffling? To do that, I did a micro CT scan. What that basically is, it's a 3D X-ray of a dead fish that I can use to look at its skeletal structure. And here you can see this fish is kind of cut in half down the middle. So you can see the vertebral column here, the head's over here, the mouth's over here. And you can see the pelvic fins over here. You can also see some of the armor over here. And these fish have an unusual adaptation that other fish don't have. They have this unusual bone called a lateropterygium. This lateropterygium directly connects their pelvic fins and their pelvic girdle to their armor. And the armor connects all the way up down here to these perineural arches that I'll discuss in a second. So indirectly, their pelvic girdle is connected to their axial skeleton. And this restricts the range of motion of their pelvic fins. But that may allow them, by having a rigid connection, that may allow them to better transmit force from their axial body, from their body muscles, to their pelvic fins, allowing them to more effectively push off the ground. And just for comparison, here's a CT scan of a goldfish. So you can see a goldfish in here. There is no connections from the pelvic girdle to the vertebral column. So this is floating down here. These ribs aren't connected, they're just floating above. Whereas you have this unusual bone here that's connecting them. And here you can see those perineural arches. So basically most fishes have a single neural arch, one spine coming up. And this is the dorsal fin with these pterygiophores sticking down. Pterygiophores are like the inside portion of a dorsal fin, where all those spines are connected to muscle. The muscle connects to this inside portion where they can tighten those muscles to lift those fins up and down. But it interlocks with these perineural arches, basically further restricting their range of motion and reducing the flexibility of these fish. So over these plecos, their morphology may both constrain and enhance them. So it constrains them into only being able to move in this one weird way. Because they're not flexible, they can't move like a snakehead or other fish on land. they have to only move on this land because that's the only way their body will physically let them move. But because of their rigid connections, it may allow them to transmit force better to the ground, allowing them to move so effectively over land, despite being heavily armored. And they move over land using ruffling, which is a completely novel form of locomotion that I described here first, using asymmetric form, using combinations of flinging their tail forward with their mouth alternately planting down, with their fins on one half the side, alternately planting down as well and protracting. And because these fish can breathe air and move over land, it gives them the potential to disperse over land. However, these fish are unlikely to come onto land much on their own. Their overland dispersal is likely facilitated by predators. So you can see, like, because these fish have really armored bodies and really big spines, they may be hard for things like herons to swallow them. However, these fish like to sit in really shallow water next to the shoreline, making them easy prey for birds and other animals that may try to eat them, and then find them too spiny to eat and end up dropping them somewhere else, allowing them to then perhaps move overland into another nearby body. So they may not come over on land there on their own, but this behavior allows them to perhaps colonize new environments. And this is similar to, let's see, do I have that? No, this may be similar with people as well. In Florida, people may use a cast net to catch some fish, and then find these armored, spiny fish tearing holes in their net, and they get angry, but they know that they're supposed to kill these fish because they're invasive. So they're like, I'm just going to hurl these fish into bushes. And that's the thing people do in Florida. And they mean well. They think they're trying to kill these invasive species, but they don't know that they can breathe air, move over land. So that may just put them on land now, where they can then move to a new body of water and colonize a new body of water. So now we figured out a little bit about why these fish go onto land. Now, how they move around on land. Now let's go into how they orient on land. So most fishes senses don't work on land. Smell doesn't work because fish can't move air through their nostrils. They can only move water, or at least it's thought that they can only do that. They have an inner ear that helps give them their information about their position on a slope, like helps them tell what up from down. That doesn't really help you navigate long distances. That just tells you if you're upright. And vision functions in air, but not as well. Think of it like vision, like you going swimming and opening your eyes underwater. Your eyes are adapted to air, but when you open your eyes underwater, you can see basic images and colors and shapes. And that's probably similar to what these amphibious fishes see out of water, where they get basic visual cues, excuse me, but they don't get the full picture. And a lot of this I learned from work on mummy chugs, this amphibious fish that's all along the coast from Nova Scotia to Florida. There also have invasive populations introduced inland, as well as they've been introduced in the Mediterranean Sea and the tributaries around there. And so mummy chug is a fish that I hold special in my heart because it's what got me into this amphibious fish world, where I was doing a summer field course when I was a freshman year in college at Shoals Marine Lab. And I had a 2-week course. 1 week you learn things, and then the second week you learn by creating your own experiment and doing something. And I noticed one of these mummy chugs was 10 feet away from the tank when I came in the lab in the morning, but it's still alive. I'm like, this 2-inch long fish was 10 feet away from this tank. And if a fish were to jump out of the water, you'd expect to move around randomly because it's a fish and it doesn't know what it's doing on land. But it could have been a coincidence. I put it back in the tank. The next day, another mummy chug from the same tank jumped and was in the exact same spot 10 feet away on the ground. I'm like, so this can't be a coincidence. So I did some more research. I did some experiments with them and found that on land, they'll do this orientation behavior. Well, they'll jump from the side, they'll land from their side, but then they'll upright for sometimes just 1/10 of a second where you can't even see it unless using a high-speed camera. Well, they'll upright, then rotate to reposition, and then fall back down on their side and jump again. I figured jumping from their side, landing on their side, why not just jump again from their side? So through some experiments, I found out that this uprighting behavior improves their vision on land, because if you have eyes on the side of your head, if you're on your side, one eye will be looking straight down in the ground and one eye will be looking straight up in the sky. But by uprighting like this, the fish can get a better lay of the land. And so I did some experiments where I found out, like, if I put them next to water, when the light was on, they could move towards the water. If I turn the light off, they move randomly. I had some night vision goggles. It was a whole fun thing where I was doing research like at 4 a.m. every day, having a nocturnal sleep schedule. It was weird, but they got some cool data. And then I replaced the water with foil and found out they would move towards aluminum foil. So in their environment, the most reflective surface they normally encounter is water. So they'll normally move towards the nearest body of water, like another tide pool. But the cue they use to find that is the reflection. And so that spot where I found them 10 feet away from the tank is where the sunlight first shined into the shiny tile floor each morning. And so these fish must have escaped, perhaps because a bigger fish was chasing them into the fish tank, jumped out of the water, was on land, and then the sun came up. These fish can breathe air, by the way. So the sun came up, they see this shiny spot, that must be a puddle, and then move towards there and then get really confused when it's not water. So that's a lot of what we know about mummy chugs and fish orientation on land. Let me take a quick sip of water. But I want to learn, how do other amphibious fishes find their way around on land? The mummy chugs have these big eyes you can see, which means that they probably have good vision and they rely on vision. However, look at these walking catfish. They got very small eyes and they got these really big whiskers. So small eyes won't be very helpful for these fish that sometimes come onto land at night and sometimes feed on land at night. Like, do you remember this eel catfish? They preferentially are nocturnal feeders and they'll feed on land at night. However, these fish are chemoreception specialists. They are coated in taste buds and they have the most sensitive sense of taste of any animal and have really sensitive taste of smell. And they also have taste buds coated all over their body and on their whiskers. And they may have other chemoreception sensors that we don't know of yet, that I'll get to in a little bit. So because they sometimes come on land at night and have these small eyes but are good at chemoreception, perhaps can walking catfish orient with chemoreception being taste and smell, just sensing chemicals. Again, they feed on land, particularly at night. And one person saw them moving upwind to a distant body of water that they couldn't see, so perhaps they're sensing something in the air. So I did some experiments where I placed these catfish in the center of arena and exposed them to a variety of chemicals. Sometimes I would spray the chemicals on one half of the arena and see if that influences their orientation, the direction they go. And other times I would put different chemicals in this distant in this pool of water around the edge to see if they can detect them when they're not in direct contact, but over a short distance. But notice when I take the bucket off, immediately before it moves, the catfish starts moving its whiskers around. And that's suggesting it's actively sensing the environment. It's trying to get a sense of the environment and feel what's in the environment to better understand, to just chemically sense the environment. Swinging the barbels around their whiskers covers a wide area. Swinging them around in the air helps them cover a wider area in the air too. And overall, I found that these fish seem to be able to orient when in direct contact with stuff. So if, let's say I spray a attractive chemical like here, like alanine or tasty amino acid that they're attracted to in the water, they'll prefer to move towards this side over this side, showing that they can use taste to orient while out of water. But more interestingly, they'll move towards natural bodies of water, like pond water right here, where they may have a lot of chemical signals coming out, evaporating from the water, emanating from the water. But if you remove the pond water and replace it with filtered water, these fish will actually move randomly. They can't sense it, suggesting there's some chemicals in natural pond water that they're detecting other than just the water itself. And interestingly, if you put a lot of hydrogen sulfide in here, a very foul-smelling, noxious substance, they'll actually move away from it, showing that they seem to be able the ability to detect chemicals from a distance on land. They can detect chemicals from a distance on land and discriminate good chemicals from bad chemicals from a distance. And it's perhaps they're using aerial taste to sense those chemical cues, or using smell with a previously undescribed smell mechanism in these fish that are adapted to smelling or detecting chemicals out of water. But I hope to learn more about, figure out the exact sense and mechanism of using this shortly in the future. I currently have a grant proposal out, hoping to get funding for that project. So we'll see what happens with that. So overall, we've seen a lot about amphibious fishes, and particularly invasive amphibious fishes. These fish will emerge when it's raining, when water conditions are poor, or some other, maybe to eat, and for other reasons we still don't understand. They can effectively move over land using a variety of methods, from ruffling to crawling and jumping and hopping and climbing and all sorts of other behaviors I didn't have time to get to. And they can find and disperse new bodies of water over land, like those catfish that can sense those bodies of water from a distance that they've never seen before, and they can find them just by detecting the chemicals in the air. And then some of them can take advantage of man-made structures for dispersal, like the storm drain system that the walking catfish use underground. So overall, because they can breathe air, they'll voluntarily come onto land. They can survive long times on land, sometimes over a day for some species, up to 2 months for others. And they can figure out where they're going and have specific motivations while on land. This makes containing invasive amphibious fishes much more difficult. And this stresses the need that we need to amend our way we manage these fish, like amend range expansion models and risk assessment and management plans to factor in that these fish may act more like amphibians than actual fish, other than fully aquatic fish. Now, these fish aren't necessarily come onto land a ton. Like the snakeheads don't come on land often. They will do sometimes. They don't come on land often, whereas the walking catfish come on land more frequently. But even coming onto land for rarely coming onto land means you still have a possibility from moving from one body of water to another body of water. In the case of snakeheads that may have escaped from a fish farm overland and moved to a nearby creek that fed into the Arkansas River, that fed into the Mississippi River, one rare instance of introduction means that these fish, overland introduction means these fish are now entered in the Mississippi River and able to spread throughout the entire country pretty much. So that's it for the amphibious fish stuff I've got prepared. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the current stuff my lab has got going on, some research that is being led by my master's student, Zach Crum. And you can see an undergrad here, Jeremy Green, helping out with. Work on blue catfish, are an invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay, originally from you can see in the yellow, the Mississippi River region, Mississippi Basin region, but they've been introduced into various localities. And these fish get really large, up to 143 pounds. And we're working with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and USGS to learn more about these fish to figure out the impacts on the ecosystems of the Chesapeake Bay. So far, we've seen a variety of things in both, and we're also looking at the impacts that snakeheads are having on the Eastern Shore as well. So we're looking at the things that are eating, first of all. So we're seeing blue crabs, striped bass, and white perch in the stomachs of blue catfish, as well as even a whole adult duck. This is an adult duck we found in the stomach of a 47-pound catfish. Snakeheads, too, we don't have much data on them yet. We're just starting that project, but we're already seeing some things like some endangered river herring, like alewives and blueback heron in their stomach. We're also doing some work to assess the health of these fish to see if they're bringing any new diseases in the system that could transmit to other fishes. So you can see, like, we discovered this new disease with these weird blisters that we're trying to describe in the catfish to figure out the health of the population. And briefly, I'm going to discuss a little bit, here's some of my scientific artwork that I create. It's a process known as clearing and staining, where I take a whole preserved fish or frog or whatever, small vertebrate, and I treat it with a series of chemicals. Some stain these fish, some stain these tissues, certain colors, like bone gets stained reddish, cartilage gets stained bluish, and then I'll make everything else transparent or dissolved. And that makes it really nice if I want to study the skeleton, like here, you can see there's the skeleton and the cartilage, nicely highlighted, nothing else. But I realized that this can make these really interesting images, and then I started using some Photoshop techniques and some storytelling techniques to expand this work into an art form that I can use for science communication, just because it gets people like, whoa, that's awesome, what's going on? I'm like, well, let me tell you about this technique. Now I can tell you about the anatomical research I'm doing with this stuff. With that, I'd like to thank everybody involved, all my collaborators, all my mentors in the past, and all the students that have made this possible. This work really would not have been possible without the help of many undergraduate and graduate students. I got to thank the National Science Foundation for funding some of the research, as well as the Animal Superpowers project, Wake Forest Department of Biology, Salisbury University, Cornell University, Friday Harbor Labs for letting me use all their imaging equipment, and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Invasive Species Grant for this. And I got to especially thank fish for this, because this awesome fish research would not be possible without fish. I'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all may have.
Noah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You can come back and you can unshare and we can come back.
Okay.
Yeah, Shireen has a question. It says, in the mid-Atlantic, have you been able to assess the impact that these invasive introduced fish have had on native fish populations?
The answer is we're working on it. We have some data so far. The big tricky thing is when you look at comparing over the mid-Atlantic, it's a really wide area, and each tributary and each body of water in there is very different. And so you have to treat them a little bit differently because there's different fish in each one. And so we're learning that we have to kind of investigate this on a river by river and body of water basis, because they're having different impacts in these different systems. In some of the tributaries in the Eastern Shore, in the Chesapeake Bay though, the blue catfish specifically seems to be having a really bad impact, where in some tributaries, particularly on the Western Shore, where they've been there a little bit longer than the Eastern Shore, but the Eastern Shore may get there. Those tributaries in the Western Shore, about 3/4 of the biomass of these rivers may be blue catfish. Meaning if you scoop out all the fish and all the life, even the planktonic stuff, the little tiny stuff, and all the plants out of the water, 3/4 of that by weight is blue catfish, which shows that even if they're only eating a little bit of things at a time, their sheer numbers are staggering, where they're having so much effect, where they're competing with native stuff, and they're eating native species. And so they're definitely have an impact. And we're working on trying to assess the quantity of the impact. Specifically, my lab is working on trying to figure out their effects in the Eastern Shore, particularly in the Nanticoke River and the river system. And we're trying to compare the snakehead and the blue catfish in this river, so we could explicitly see, compare their diets to see if we can tie one species or the other, or both or neither, to the losses of certain fishes. So we're working on that. But overall, it seems to lead that, sure, the snakeheads may eat some fish here and there, but the blue catfish are in such staggering numbers that the snakeheads are a drop in the bucket compared to the blue catfish. And if we had to focus efforts on one, the blue catfish seem to be a lot worse. But that's preliminary. We're still working on figuring that out more. But on this front, my lab has got a grant to host an invasive species fishing tournament on the Nanticoke River this coming up Saturday, where we recruit the help of hundreds of anglers are going to go out through the river. They're all going to catch us a bunch of fish, remove them from the river. And not only is that removing those invasive species from the river, and we're encouraging anglers to be the predators to these fish, to keep their population in check and keep eating them, and and hopefully act as a long-term predator to keep their population down and their effects down. But all the fish in that tournament is going to be used for our research to help learn more about what these fish are eating and their effects in the ecosystem, along with their growth rate, their health, their reproductive rate, and things like that.
That's a great project. That's so fun. I'm going to follow up on Shireen's question, because people are concerned about the crabs, and I saw that the blue catfish eating crabs. Is there any correlation between the decline in the blue crab populations and the increase in blue catfish?
The answer is yes, but so the answer is yes. Like, so we are seeing blue crabs in the stomachs of these catfish. So obviously, and the sheer numbers of the catfish obviously means they are having a negative effect on the blue crabs. However, we still can't assess how bad the negative effect is until we get all our data in, like how many crabs they're eating. They're definitely not helping the population. There were some estimates. I was on a conversation with a big work group on catfish yesterday in the Chesapeake Bay, and in one tributary, they seemed to do a study where it seemed like out of one stretch of one of the tributaries on the Western Shore, they thought that blue catfish may be eating 3.2 million crabs per year. And so that's likely having a big impact. And so, yes, they are having impact, but there's also some other impacts as well, as like poor water quality, climate change, over harvesting. there's a variety of factors. It's not just one factor impacting them. There's multiple factors impacting them. But the blue crabs are definitely not helping the population and are likely making it worse. I can't say if they're the worst problem to the crabs right now, just because we don't have that data yet, but they are a problem for the crabs.
Wow.
And the striped bass as well.
Yeah, Greg asks, in theory, are these air-breathing organs sufficient enough for the oxygen requirements for the fish to survive completely if desiccation is not a factor?
Yeah, so it depends on the fish. Some fish can only breathe air for a little bit. Some fish can breathe, like the mangrove rivulus can breathe air for up to 2 months at a time out of water. And like the walking catfish and snakeheads, they can also breathe air for like walking catfish and snakeheads both can breathe air for about a day out of water. Same with the plecos. A big issue though is these fish, they don't just breathe through their gills, they eliminate hazardous waste through their gills. And so while they can breathe air, let's say like nitrogenous waste, like you may normally urinate out, fish get rid of in their gills, may accumulate in their tissues, and they may not be able to get rid of that waste until they find new water. And so that may be a limiting factor to them. Oh, I see a question about my Twitter handle. My Twitter handle is @NoahWithFish. That's also Instagram, easy to remember, @NoahWithFish.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I had a question because you go fishing and the fish comes off of the hook and it goes onto the ground and it's flapping all over the place trying to get back in the water. How is that a similar locomotion strategy that you're seeing with this, or is it completely different? And I'm not being in tuned to it, can't tell the difference.
No, there is a difference. And the amphibious fish world. So first of all, it's a spectrum. It's not you're amphibious, you're not amphibious. Sometimes fish you can go on land for like a quick second. Some you can go on land for a couple minutes. Some you can go on land for hours. Like some you can only move a little bit. Some you can move faster. It's a big spectrum. But the amphibious fish world is full of a lot of fun or goofy fish terms. There are for different ways fish move around the land. There are squiggles, there are wriggles, there are wiggles, there are tail jam wiggles, tail flip jumps, thrashes, flips, and flops. Ruffling, I got to add to that there. And so there's a lot of different terms. So the term that most fish will do, if you put, let's say, a largemouth bass or a random fish like a sunfish, any fish a striped bass, anything that can't move around on land, you put it on the ground, it will do what's known as a thrash. And that's basically, it just flails randomly, hoping that its random spastic movements will move it towards water. If it's on a hill, randomly bouncing around up and down may make it move towards the hill, but it's random movement that is uncoordinated and doesn't really move them very well. It may not move them anywhere, but sitting still and dying is a worse option than struggling for life to try to, like, even let's say a person who doesn't know how to swim gets thrown into the water, they're not going to just give up. They're going to randomly thrash and try to get somewhere. And so these fish are doing something different. You saw they were doing like the snakeheads and all those other fish, they're doing very coordinated movements where they're coordinating their depending on the type of fish, the different parts of their body, and they're coordinating them in a repetitive cyclical cycle that allows them to move in and cover distance over land rather than moving randomly. And combined with orientation behaviors, they're not just physically moving randomly and with undirected movement, they are able to direct their movement towards wherever they want to go.
Got it. Thank you for that. And you mentioned also that, I can't remember which one it was, the Pleco, maybe it was the fastest fish on land. So is there an ongoing tracking that? How are you tracking
Well, it's one of them. And that was the instantaneous velocity where it happened to push off a wall. And so just being fastest, like in the sprint, doesn't mean it can cover much distance. And so I want to do some studies on snakehead, on Pleco, like on how these fish, I have a proposal to work on to figure out the maximum distances these things cover on land, like how quickly do they tire, things like that. Just like if you can, a sprinter is not going to run their sprinting distance for a full length of a marathon. And so still working, trying to comparing different locomotor behaviors and speeds and things like that. Like there's some, even like, so, for example, there's a video I saw online of an arapaima, one of the world's largest freshwater fish. And these fish seem to be able to move over land. And I only have one video example, but they may seem like they can move even more quickly over land than any of the other fishes, which would make sense if you're a 6-foot-long fish moving around over land, you can cover more distance quickly. Then again, eels are also really quick because they can just move over land like a snake, and I've seen them move very quickly in my own experience handling eels on land.
Greg asks, have you studied why they prefer Payless over other shoe stores in Florida?
I think they just like the storm drains there. They got really nice storm drains, nice wide vents there, maybe a lot of standing water under it, maybe, and that may be why they'll also appear in like Walmart parking lots, middle of streets and stuff. They just maybe there was just one big incident in Lakeland, Florida, where a lot of them came on, and then multiple people reported that, which skewed that as that. But never know. Maybe these walking catfish they're starting to get tired and getting some abrasions on their fins and need to get some shoes to help them move around.
Any other questions for Dr. Bressman? You're currently at 447. What's on the horizon? What are you trying to get next?
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do much adventurous fishing in a while. I haven't caught many new species on hook and line just because I'm in an area I've fished a bunch plenty now. And I've already caught a lot of that fish in this area. But I had on a trip recently, I was going to get golden tilefish to my list, and I was going to do some work on that with a charter captain. But the weather was bad, so we had to cancel and hopefully I can reschedule. We're also going to just drop, he's going to help me just drop some small hooks down to like 1,000 feet down and just pull up all sorts of weird stuff, and maybe we can describe a new species. Some other ones I want to add, I really want to add cobia to my list. That's off on the top, and a wahoo, and maybe a white marlin if I ever enter into the white marlin open at Ocean City. But that's a little pricey entry fee apparently.
Well, we wish you luck on that, and I do hope I appreciate you. This was a wonderful presentation, and I do hope that we will coordinate doing some more things together. And
sounds good.
With your, yeah, and I do hope you feel better. I'm so double appreciative that you're doing this while you're suffering. So thank you very much, and now go heal.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll be healthy enough to be able to attend my own fishing tournament that I'm hosting on Saturday. But if not, my grad student will have to step up and run it. But he's more than capable, but I don't want to push all that pressure on him.
Right. Well, everyone, thanks for coming. Stay well and stay curious, and we'll see you in I guess a couple of weeks, next week, if you want to learn about the Dunklesaurus, and then we're having Maryland catfish. So we had a little bit of a taste of that today. We will learn more about catfish in Maryland on the 18th of August. So come back and see us. Take care, everybody.
Pleasure speaking to all of y'all.